All right, let's talk about Moore's three types of interaction in distance learning. And I think these are important types of interaction to understand as we move forward. Um, Basically, the background for this is that distance learning was brought about, and as we started to really look closer at distance learning, yeah, it's been around for many years, but especially online learning, which is a part of distance learning, that has come about recently. When we started to see that come about, we started to examine what works with teaching and learning in general, maybe a little bit more closely than we had before. And so we developed deeper frameworks to describe learning and understand what was happening with online learning. And a lot of these theories were based on face-to-face learning, but were extended to online. And so this is no different of a theory, and this is a seminal theory, meaning that it was something that came about a long time ago, but people still refer to it quite a bit even today. I think it was in the 80s, maybe the late 80s, or yeah, early 90s. I think it was the late 80s, 89 I think is when the article came out. So it caused us to examine what works when we went to distance learning, and we needed to figure out, describe the teaching and learning process in a better way so that we could understand how to maximize the possibility of learning within distance learning situations. So this is Moore, and he talked about three types of interaction that happen in learning, and in particular online or distance learning. And he said learner to content is one area, learner to instructor is another, and learner to learner is the third. So these are the three types of interaction that one can focus on as we move forward and learn about online learning. So the first one, of course, is learner to content. And this is basically just the learners themselves, whoever's learning, it's the students in your class or whoever the learners are, intellectually interacting with content. And as they interact with the content, that is learning. That can bring about the change in a learner's mind to help them to do the learning that they're supposed to do. And Moore talks about this internal didactic conversation that's going on inside the learner's head as they're interacting with these elements. They're focusing on what they're supposed to be learning, whether it's reading or watching or some other activity that helps them to learn. There's a learner in learner-to-content interaction. They're having this internal conversation, thinking about what they're reading, thinking about what they're saying. If they're not thinking about it, then they're not really learning anything, right? We all know those situations where maybe we were reading something and then we look back and say, what was I reading? It's a pretty common activity, actually. But if we're having that internal conversation, and if we can support that, then we have a more effective type of learner-to-content interaction. The second type of interaction is learner-to-instructor. Again, these are ways to describe what happens in distance learning. So another type of interaction is learner to instructor. And so the instructor has the role of maintaining student interest, motivation in the content, organizing the application and practice of what is taught to make sure that learners have the opportunity to practice those things. The instructor should assess learning. The instructor has the role of supporting and counseling the learning process, and the instructor also has conversations with the learner, whether it's live in a class setting where maybe the online learning is happening live where people can interact. But back in the 1980s, when he wrote about this, it was more about conversations between the instructor and the student work. So he was thinking more about during the grading process, whether that's online or on paper. The instructor is kind of having a conversation with the student by reading the student's paper or other type of work, and responding, giving feedback on different elements of that work. And through those conversations, that's really the heart of learner to instructor interaction, as it lists here. So that's learner to instructor interaction. And then finally, learner to learner interaction. And of course, back then, this wasn't as common. There weren't as many opportunities to allow this to happen in online learning in the 80s, obviously. But interaction between a learner and other learners is part of this, and with or without the presence of an instructor. But also, if you notice, it does say with the presence of an instructor as well. So the instructor could be a part of, let's say, the discussion board or whatever other interaction the learners are having with one another. So that's also one of the three types of interaction that Moore mentions. So these three types of interaction are the basis for an assignment that you'll do next week when you'll look at a MOOC, or a massive open online course, and evaluate the three types of interaction that happen in this course based on these three elements. Is there learner to content interaction? Is there learner to instructor interaction? And is there learner to learner interaction in these courses? Now, Moore's three types of interaction, as he talked about this, it's a way to describe online learning, but I think also it's a way to maybe evaluate the online learning experience. And if we evaluate the online learning experience that happens here, we can think about, is there sufficient learner to content interaction? Is there sufficient learner to instructor interaction? And is there sufficient learner to learner interaction for the learning to happen? And the idea is that if there is a lot of all three of these and all three are present, then it's likely that learning will happen effectively. But if there are only two of the three or one of the three in large measure and the other two are not exhibited, then that could be an issue for learning. So that's something to think about for next week, I think, and also as you read the article from Moore this week. I believe that's assigned to everybody as the last reading for this week.